Good morning. It's a pleasure to be back in India. It's a pleasure to be here, and I owe a debt of gratitude to the India Foundation and to General Hasnain for having facilitated, and thank you all for joining us. Having said that, I fear that the organizers of this conference may regret having given me the honor to kick off this panel. The reason is that I question its very premise. I don't think there is an ideological challenge. The sad truth is that governments, law enforcement, security forces, intellectuals, and journalists do not have an ideological response to political violence's last reiteration, jihadism. But even if they did, the effort to counter religiously cloaked extremism cannot be primarily ideological. It has to be politics and policy. Complicating things is the fact that responders are repeating their past mistakes. Al-Qaeda produced the counterterrorism industry in the context of a response that was focused on law enforcement, security, and military engagement. It has enhanced, to be sure, that has produced significant results. It has enhanced security across the globe, stopped plots before they could be executed, driven Al-Qaeda into the caves, and deprived the Islamic State of its territorial base. All of that, however, has not solved the problem, nor has it fundamentally reduced the attraction of religiously cloaked extremism. No doubt, social media has provided militants with a megaphone. But let's be clear. Social media are vehicles, media channels. They are not drivers. Yet much like the terrorism industry, the call for a counter-narrative has produced an industry of its own. Like the terrorism industry, it has vested interests of its own. Its sustainability is dependent on the continued existence of perceived real threats. Further troubling the waters is the fact that the public and private anti-terrorism and counter-terrorism industries see human rights as second to ensuring security and safety, have little interest in addressing the problem through notions of alienation, marginalization, socioeconomic disenfranchisement, youth aspirations, and basic rights in which counter-terrorism and counter-narratives would be embedded. Aiding and abetting the problem are ever more evident campaigns by non-egalitarian and non-inclusive democratic societies, as well as autocratic Middle Eastern and North African regimes that either have reduced interest in independent analysis and reporting, seek to restrict freedoms of expression and the press, or define any form of dissent as terrorism. The notion that one can eradicate political violence is illusionary. Political violence has been a fixture of human history since day one and is likely to remain a fact of life. Its ebbs and flows often correlate to economic, social, political up and down turns. In other words, counterterrorism and counter-narratives will only be effective if they are embedded in far broader policies that tackle root causes. And that is where the shoe pinches. To develop policies that tackle root causes, that are inclusive, and aim to ensure that at least the vast majority, if not everyone, has a stake in society, the economy, and the political system, involves painful decisions, revising often long-standing policies, and tackling vested interests. Few politicians and bureaucrats are inclined to do so. Starting with Al-Qaeda's 9/11 attacks, militants have benefited from the fact that the world was entering a cyclical period in which populations lose confidence in political systems and leaderships. The single largest success of Osama bin Laden and subsequent militants is the fact that they were able to disrupt efforts to forge inclusive, multicultural societies, nowhere more so than first in Europe, then the United States with the rise of Donald Trump, and since then with ripple effects in Asia, including here in India. The result is the rise of secular and religious nationalism, populism, greater acceptance of the autocratic or illiberal rule, and the erosion of democratic values and institutions. Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and other forms of ethnic and religious prejudice that no doubt existed, but lived under a cloud of primarily social taboos and have become socially acceptable and often politically convenient. Of course, the refugee crisis put oil on the fire. Nonetheless, what makes this cycle of lack of confidence more worrisome and goes directly to the question of the ideological challenge is how it differs from the late 1960s, the last time we witnessed a breakdown in confidence and leadership on a global scale. The difference between then and now is that then there were all kinds of worldviews on offer: anti-authoritarianism, anarchism, socialism, communism, concepts of extra-parliamentary opposition, and in the Middle East and North Africa, Arab nationalism and Arab socialism. Today, the only one thing on offer are radical interpretations of Islam and jihadism. Human rights activist and former Tunisian president Monsef Marzouki was asked in a Wall Street Journal interview, why is it that not only those who lacked opportunity and felt that they had no prospects and no hopes, but also educated Tunisians with jobs who were joining the Islamic State? His answer was, it's not simply a matter of socioeconomic roots. You have to go deeper and understand that these guys have a dream, and we don't. We had a dream. Our dream was called the Arab Spring, and our dream is now turning into a nightmare. But the young people need a dream, and the only dream available to them now is the Caliphate. It's hard to build an ideological challenge or develop counter-narratives if one does not have a dream. With democracy on the defense, free market enterprise having failed significant segments of the public, and newly found legitimacy for prejudice, bias, and bigotry, democratic governments are incapable of credibly projecting a dream, one that is backed up by policies that hold out realistic hopes of producing results. Autocrats are in no better situation. The mayhem in the Middle East and North Africa is not exclusively, but in many ways due to their inability and failure to deliver public goods and services. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman appeared to be holding out a dream for his kingdom, but that dream increasingly is being shattered, both in Yemen and at home. Autocrats in the Middle East and North Africa are about upgrading and modernizing their regimes to ensure their survival, not about real, sustainable change. Elsewhere, populists and nationalists advocating racial, ethnic, and religious purity and protectionist economic policies are unlikely to fare any better. What this means is that identifying the root causes of political violence demands self-inspection on the part of governments and societies across the globe. It is those governments and societies that are both part of the problem and part of the solution. It is those governments and elites that are at the root of the loss of confidence. Translating the need to tackle root causes into policy is proving difficult, primarily because it is based on a truth that has far-reaching consequences for every member of the international community. It involves governments putting their money where their mouth is and changing long-standing, ingrained policies at home that marginalize, exclude, stereotype, and stigmatize significant segments of society, emphasize security at the expense of freedoms that encourage healthy debate, and in more autocratic states that are embedded by the West, seek to reduce citizens to obedient subjects through harsh repression and adaptations of religious and political beliefs to suit the interests of the rulers. The result is a vicious circle. Government policies often clash with the state or regime's professed values. As a result, dividing lines sharpen as already marginalized, disenfranchised, or discriminated segments of society see the contradiction between policies and values as hypocritical and reconfirmation of the basis of their discontent. Creating a policy framework that is conducive to an environment in the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia that would favor pluralism and respect of human rights and counter the appeal of jihadism and emerging sectarian-based nationalism is not simply a question of encouraging and supporting voices in the region, the first and foremost among which youth, or of revisiting assumptions of Western foreign policies and definitions of national security. It involves fostering inclusive national identities that are capable of accommodating ethnic, sectarian, and tribal sub-identities as legitimate and fully accepted in Middle Eastern, North African, South Asian, as well as Western countries. It involves changing domestic policies towards minorities, refugees, and migrants. Inclusiveness means that victory has to be secured as much in militant strongholds in a swath of land that stretches from the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, as in the dismal banlieues, run-down, primarily minority-populated suburbs of French cities that furnish the Islamic State with its largest contingent of European foreign fighters. In the popular neighborhoods in Tunisia that accounted for the single largest group of foreign fighters in Syria and Iraq. In Riyadh, seat of a government whose citizens accounted for the second largest contingent of foreign fighters, and whose well-funded, decades-long effort to propagate a Puritan, intolerant interpretation of Islam has been a far more important feeding ground than the jihadist thinking and writings of militants like Sayyid Qutb. And finally, in Western capitals, with Washington in the lead, who view retrograde repressive regimes like those of Saudi Arabia and Egypt as part of the solution rather than part of the problem. In territorial terms, the Islamic State has been defeated, but the problem remains unresolved. Al-Qaeda was degraded, to use the language of the Obama administration. In the process, it weakened a jihadist force that increasingly had advocated a gradual approach to the establishment of its harsh interpretation of Islamic law in a bid to ensure public support. Instead of reducing the threat of political violence, the largely military effort to defeat Al-Qaeda produced ever more virulent forms of jihadism, as embodied by the Islamic State. It may be hard to imagine that anything more brutal than the group can emerge, but it is a fair assumption that defeating the Islamic State without tackling root causes could lead to something that is even more vicious and even more violent. Defining repressive autocratic rule and the Islamic State as the greatest threat to stability and security and the furthering of more liberal notions is problematic. In the case of the Islamic State, that definition elevates jihadism, the violent establishment of pan-Islamic rule based on narrow interpretations of Islamic law and scripture, to the status of a root cause, rather than a symptom and an expression of a greater and more complex problem. It is an approach that focuses on the immediate nature of the threat and ways to neutralize it, rather than on what sparked it. It also neglects the fact that the ideological debate in the Muslim world, to a large extent, is dominated by schools of thought that do not advocate more open, liberal, and pluralistic interpretations. That is where one real challenge lies. It is a challenge first and foremost to Muslims, but also to an international community that would give more liberal Muslim voices significant credibility if it put its money where its mouth is. Support for self-serving regimes and their religious supporters, as in the case of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, reduces the international community's choices to one between bad and worse, rather than to a palette of policy options that take a stab at rooting out the problem and its underlying causes. There are no quick solutions or shortcuts, and the value of partial solutions is questionable. The key is the articulation of policies that over the medium term can help generate an environment more conducive to change, rather than the continuous opting for knee-jerk reactions to events and facts on the ground. One place to look for alternative approaches is Norway. In contrast to most reactions to political violence and expression of pro-jihadist sentiment, Norway's response to right-wing extremist Anders Behring Breivik's traumatic attacks in 2011 that killed 77 people stands as a model for how societies can and should uphold concepts of pluralism and human rights. Norway refrained from declaring war on terror, treated Breivik as a common criminal, and refused to compromise on its democratic values. In doing so, Norway offered a successful example of refusing to stigmatize any one group in society by adopting inclusiveness rather than profiling and upholding the very values that autocrats and jihadists challenge. The result of exclusively security-focused approaches, coupled with the expression of economic opportunity by autocratic Middle Eastern and North African regimes and Western governments, is an increasingly insecure region in which the creation of pluralistic societies that honor human rights seems ever more distant. Said an Egyptian Islamist militant whose nonviolent anti-government activism is as much aimed at opposing the regime of General-turned-President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi as it is designed to persuade increasingly frustrated youth that there are alternatives to nihilistic violence. The strategy of brutality, repression, and restricting freedom has failed to impose subservience. It hasn't produced solutions. Governments need to give people space. They need to prove that they are capable of addressing the problems of a youth that has lost hope. We have nothing to lose if they don't. The Egyptians' inclinations pointed towards peaceful protest in favor of a more liberal society, albeit bound by Islamic morality codes. His options, however, left him little choice but to drift towards jihadism. Thank you.